All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the National Research Collaborative for Foster Alumni and Higher Education webinar series. My name is Jenna Thompson, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a doctoral student in the Prevention Science program at Washington State University. This webinar will be recorded and available through the NRC FAHE website that can be found here on this slide. Also on that slide, you can subscribe to receive information about upcoming webinars. You are able to turn on your closed captioning if you would like to see the live transcription options via your Zoom menu. We have a couple of upcoming webinars. The first in March will be an external webinar through the TAY Coalition presentation. You can join to hear about the Urban Institute's latest research on the Chafee Education and Training Vouchers program. Additionally, you can sign up for the April webinar that will be held on April 27th at 11 to noon Pacific time. The presenters will be Justine Chung and Dr. Cynthia Leitz and Osha Sempel from Arizona State University School of Social Work, and they will be presenting their findings from a recent study of the Aspire Mental Health Support Program for students with foster care experience. And more information will be forthcoming via the website and via the newsletter if you subscribe. So today we will have about 35 minutes for the presentation, followed by a Q&A session. So feel free throughout the presentation to type messages or type your questions into the chat that we will have time to discuss near the end. So I'm pleased today to present Dr. Melanie Doucet. She's an adjunct professor at McGill University School of Social Work and senior researcher and project manager with the Child Welfare League of Canada based in Montreal, Quebec. And with that, I will go ahead and turn the time over to Dr. Doucet.
Thank you. I'll take the opportunity here to share my screen and then start the presentation. I'm having the same issue that I was having before. Hold on. Oh, that's okay. I'll proceed, and if anything's going wrong, you can just let me know via the mic because I can't see anybody right now. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Melanie Doucet. I am currently the senior researcher and project manager at the Child Welfare League of Canada, and this is where this project that I'm going to talk about today is currently housed. I also have a PhD in social work from McGill University, and I'm also a former youth in care myself. So I have lived experience in foster care and also have aged out at the age of majority. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the project that I've been leading since summer 2021 on supporting equitable transitions to adulthood for youth in care across the country. So before we get started, I thought I'd show a video, which is the video from my doctoral project, which I did back in 2017, 2018. And it really contextualizes the experiences of youth aging out of care in Canada, as well as in British Columbia, which is where I did my project. So I'm going to be showing that first and foremost, just so that you can kind of get a sense of what the experiences are in Canada in comparison to in the States, as well as some statistics. And then I'll jump right into the project that we're currently working on.
Think about your turning of age birthday. Were you ready to be a fully self-sufficient adult? Think back to when you first moved out of your parents' home. Were you able to return if you needed a place to stay or a place to spend the holidays? Were you able to count on them and maintain a relationship after you moved out?
When I was younger and while I was in ministry care, I was separated from my sisters, so I basically aged out on my own in separate towns of my family.
For youth in long-term care, this is their reality. If they are unable to find forever homes during their time in care, they must rapidly transition to adulthood at the young age of 18 or 19, with no option to return in times of crisis.
And because of that, I ended up homeless. I was lucky enough to find places, find roommates, but it didn't really turn out the way that it should have when I turned 19.
This is due to provincial legislation across Canada mandating child welfare agencies to release youth from their care at the age of majority. This contrasts with the experience of their peers, who tend to stay at home up until the age of 29 and continue to rely on their families, friends, and communities throughout their adult lives. Due to this cutoff of supports, youth exiting care tend to have limited support networks, and most of the connections made during their time in care are formal, paid for, and have an expiry date. This is despite research indicating that supportive long-term relationships can act as a bridge during this difficult transition. Research also illustrates that the status quo is not working. Most young people exiting care are at high risk of experiencing multiple difficulties. Child welfare decision-making often does not include youth in care's perspectives, and their voices are often left out.
Children and youth in care are rarely asked for their input when the decision to remove them from their homes and their family of origin is made. We have no options to choose for ourselves and have no control over the direction our life is taking. These practices need to change, and children and youth from care need to be involved in all decision-making discussions.
This collaborative photo voice research project aimed to take a closer look through the power of images and accompanying captions at the relationships that matter to youth from care and how those relationships can be developed, nurtured, and sustained over time in a healthy way.
I hope that people really, after this exhibit, realize that foster youth are also living, breathing people that have personalities.
Preliminary results showcase the need for broadening the definition of family to include pets and parent-like mentors, and broadening the definition of community to include online forms of connection. Connections to spirituality, culture, and the land were also identified as important, especially for racialized and Indigenous youth.
For our dear young ones that are in foster care right now, we ask a blessing for them. We want to carry a good vision that we're all part of a family, and we realize it and we recognize it and we feel the love and the kindness and the warmth of a family, all of us.
As a former youth in care myself, this project is close to my heart. Through our collaborative research, my co-researchers and I aim to showcase that youth in and from care have a basic need for connection to others, just like their peers do.
Forming relationships with youth in and from care so that our relationships with the system are not devoid of warmth and understanding.
We should also be given the opportunity, as part of our healing journey, to make connections with those people who will have positivity in our lives and help us build social capital.
As human beings, we cannot and should not have to exist self-sufficiently and independently from others. Our peers who are not in care are not expected to age out of their families at the age of majority and continue to rely on others throughout their adulthood. This is simply a normal part of life for them. However, youth in and from care are taught to become self-sufficient as they prepare to age out of the system, which imposes a lot of stress on them as they deal with yet another drastic transition in their lives.
After we transition, we should be able to keep, these long-term relationships that we have built in the system, regardless of who they were with. Like, your counselor or people that you met, in your group homes, or not have restrictions on housing or based around even your pets.
To keep our inner fire alive, we need to be interconnected to others who can help us thrive within our communities. We need to be provided with the same level of ongoing care, support, and love that our peers receive, so we can get a fighting chance to thrive and not just survive.
Sorry, sometimes it does that. So I just wanted to show that because it really contextualizes the experiences of young people here in Canada in terms of aging out of care. And I think there's a lot of similarities with the experiences of youth in the United States as well. So moving on to the project that I'm currently working on at the Child Welfare League of Canada. I'm currently working alongside a National Council of Youth in Care Advocates, which is comprised of youth in care networks from across the country, as well as youth in care alumni who are now advocates in their communities and in their home provinces and territories, and a few key ally organizations such as the Child Welfare League of Canada and Away Home Canada. And I work alongside this National Council on this project, but we first got together at the very beginning of the pandemic in March 2020 out of our collective concern for youth aging out during the pandemic, because the government here in Canada was making all these announcements and established a social support program, financial support program for folks during the pandemic. But the ministries responsible for youth in care were not making any announcements as it related to aging out of care during the pandemic. So we were very concerned about this, given that the precarity of young people in care and the difficulties surrounding aging out of care without a pandemic. So this was really heightening the danger and the risk that youth in care are exposed to, in addition to a physical danger that was now being introduced. So what we did at the very beginning of our inception as the National Council, we advocated at a national level for moratoriums on aging out of care. So moratoriums meaning we were asking provinces and territories to pause aging out for the duration of the pandemic so that youth had the possibility of staying in their current placements and continuing to receive supports and services as usual. So we were able to be successful in quite a few jurisdictions across the country. And in Canada, like I mentioned in the video, the jurisdiction of Child Protection Services and administration, as well as legislation, is under the provinces and territories, for the exception of First Nations youth who are on reserve. That is under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So we were advocating for moratoriums to be established across Canada. And as you can see on this map, which is dated from March 2021, we were successful in quite a few jurisdictions. So the ones in yellow, we were able to successfully get moratoriums in place with various expiration dates for those moratoriums. So since that time, we decided to shift our focus on longer term solutions. But you can see here at our most up-to-date map, while there's some jurisdictions that have resumed transitions, some jurisdictions decided to make the emergency measures or moratoriums that they had put in place permanent, or are starting to look at more longer term solutions for transitions to adulthood for youth in care. So you can see those in yellow in the map. So in British Columbia, they decided to make the temporary emergency measures they had put in place permanent, and they're starting to look at expanding their agreements for young adults program up to the age of 27. In Manitoba, they decided to implement a Supports to Young Adults grant program, which is in place up until, I believe, the end of this month, and with the goal of having a reform of the current processes for transitions out of care. In Ontario, they very recently announced a new initiative. They're calling it Ready, Set, Go for transitions from care, which will come into place April 1st of this year. And they're extending the age limit from 18 to 23. And the moratorium is in place until this becomes active. In New Brunswick, they have extended the moratorium until November of this year, at which time they will have a new legislation in place. It's called the Child and Youth Wellbeing Act. And within that act, there are provisions for transitions from care for youth and guaranteeing a certain degree of programs and supports and services. So this is good, but however, our work since about June 2021 has really been focusing on longer term solutions and how do we go about reforming the process that is currently underway for young people as they transition to adulthood. Because some folks, depending on where they live across Canada, might not even have a transition at all. It's a cutoff at the age of majority, which varies between 18 and 19 across the country. So we really wanted to develop some solutions that ensured that no matter where a young person lives in the country, that they have a minimum guaranteed degree of supports and services as they transition to adulthood, and that they're not forced to transition before they're ready. So this is where we decided to move our focus on once we were able to get moratoriums in place, because we said, you know, youth in care also deserve this new normal that the Prime Minister kept talking about in press releases, saying that we were going to enter a new normal in Canadian society. So we wanted to develop a roadmap for how young people in and from care can also have a new normal that is better than the status quo that was present before the pandemic came into play. And so we developed the Equitable standards for transitions to adulthood for youth in care. And we released these standards in October of 2021. So really, this was about creating standards that any province or territory could adhere to, because currently we don't have national standards here in Canada. We don't have national legislation either because of this provincial territorial jurisdiction. And so we have no guaranteed level of supports and services for young people as they transition to adulthood. It's not legislated and it's not in policy either. So we wanted to really establish those in a way that were developed by and for young people with lived experience. So in terms of standards, what do we mean by that term? For the Equitable standards, it's about establishing minimum key elements that need to be in place before a young person exits the child protection system and transitions to adulthood. And this is regardless of their age, their place of residence, their legal and or placement status, or the type of placement. So for example, in Canada, we have different types of out-of-home care. So residential group home units, foster care, kinship placements, and so on. And we know that as of now, a lot of the eligibility criteria for post-care supports tend to screen out a lot of those placement types. It's usually for folks who have been in long-term foster care or who have been assigned as, in out-of-home care until majority, in permanent care. So what we aim to do with these standards is that it's available and accessible to any young person who's been placed in out-of-home care, regardless of their status as well as age. We also understand that the term standards is often a loaded word in government, and it wasn't something that was taken, with open arms at first. Oftentimes, the government stakeholders that we were meeting with they were like, oh, we don't know if we want to call them standards. But we really emphasize that, yes, we need to call them standards. This is what youth in and from care are saying that they need. They need a standard of care, and it currently doesn't exist. And it's the standard of care that they deserve and that they want. So we need to get comfortable with using the word standard because they currently don't exist. And really our overarching goal with these standards is to ensure that youth in care are afforded the same standard of support and opportunities for success as they transition to adulthood as their peers who aren't in the child protection system, but also while recognizing that there's inherent trauma impact of removing a child from their home of origin and separating them. And also there's inherent trauma in terms of their trajectory within the system as well. So that needs to be acknowledged. And that's why we use the term equitable. So equity recognizes that one size doesn't fit all. So providing the same supports to everyone through universal types of programs, it doesn't elevate everyone to the same level or standard. So using an approach that's centered on equity, it recognizes that every single young person has different circumstances, and it allocates the exact supports, resources, and opportunities that are needed for each young person to reach the outcomes that are close to equal to those in the general population. Because as you know, the statistics right now, they don't show anything that's near equal to those of the youth in the general population, and we really want to change that. The implementation of the standards also has to be done in a trauma-informed way. Because youth in care, like I mentioned, they live with various forms of trauma, and that can manifest in different ways. And that includes the inability to seek out or accept help. It can also include, defiant behaviors due to, attachment issues or trust breaches with adults in their experiences. It can also include shutting down and not engaging. So, the door should always be left open for young people to change their minds about accepting help and seeking help, or to even come back for help. So we're advocating for no closed files. So really our vision through this project and through the equitable standards is that we dream of a world where the term aging out, it no longer exists. It doesn't exist in our vocabulary. It doesn't exist in academia. It doesn't exist in research. It doesn't exist in child protection legislation and mandates. We really dream of a society where youth in care are interdependently supported throughout their entire lives, just as there's their peers who aren't in care, who can rely on their family, their friends, and communities well beyond the age of majority, and really for their entire lives. That's usually how life works in the general population, is you're never truly completely alone. And I want to read this quote by one of the National Council members that really emphasizes why these standards are needed. Youth in care should not be considered as disposable by the systems who are responsible for their care, but rather they must be recognized as worthy of the social and financial investments that will help them grow into thriving adults. So that's really what we're advocating for here, is that young people need to be invested in, and also holistically. So not just in a piecemeal fashion or just in one aspect of their lives. They need to be invested in a holistic way so that they have the chance to thrive. So we came up with the 8 transition to adulthood pillars, so that key areas that need to be focused on for a young person to be able to have a healthy development pathway to adulthood. So these aren't in order of priority, so they have to be addressed holistically. I will emphasize, however, that the financial pillar is a foundational pillar. So it has to accompany all the other pillars. So for example, for housing, financial support needs to be included in that. For education, financial support also needs to be included in that. So it has to be included all across the 8 pillars. Young people from care should not be expected to pay for all these things by themselves. So the 8 transition to adulthood pillars are the financial pillar, educational and professional development, housing, relationships, culture and spirituality, health and well-being, advocacy and rights, and emerging adulthood development. And then we have the equitable standards. So there's a standard statement that's attached to every single pillar. And this is really what we want key stakeholders who work with youth in and from care to strive to achieve. So for the financial pillar, the standard is that every young person should have the financial resources required to meet their needs. Youth in care deserve to have a financial starting point that is above the poverty line and allows them to pursue their career interests and dreams. And like I mentioned, this pillar is absolutely foundational. The way that things work currently in Canada, young people from care often exit immediately into poverty. They live below the poverty line, and it's oftentimes a cycle that they're not able to get themselves out of. So it's really foundational and sets them up in terms of being able to focus on all those other areas in their lives. For the educational and professional development pillar, the standard is that every young person should experience an environment where they can learn and grow in ways that are meaningful to them and at their own pace. And again, that's something that's really important because as we see in the statistics, young people from care, if they're not allowed to learn in meaningful ways and at their own pace, they don't get that high school diploma. So that's something that we really want to reinforce. And we also want them to be able to choose the pathways that they want instead of feeling like they don't have a choice or that they can't dream to be something because of the outcomes and the statistics. So we really want young people to be invested in and supported in the ways that they choose and the dreams that they have. And again, this component also needs to be accompanied with health and wellness supports as well, because a person who's struggling with trauma, struggling with undiagnosed learning disabilities, mental health issues, is not going to do well in school if they're not supported in that way. The housing pillar, the standard is every young person should have a place they can call home without strict rules and conditions to abide by. And what we mean by that is oftentimes housing programs or transitional housing programs for young people from care are tied to over surveillance, are tied to program rules and restrictions that aren't realistic. And it further institutionalizes them. And that's oftentimes a barrier for youth wanting to participate in these types of programmings. And it also doesn't provide equity because the experiences are just not comparable to those of the young people in the general population. So they have a right to live a normal life as they transition to adulthood. And that's what that last statement means. In terms of relationship pillar, the standard is that every young person should have people in their life that they can count on unconditionally and interdependently. Youth in care need to feel that they belong, have worth, and are valuable members of their communities. And as you saw in the video, this is something that's often missing in terms of their trajectory in care, as well as the planning for the transition to adulthood. Oftentimes, it's really not focused on at all, and young people leave the system without any informal social support networks to rely on. The fifth pillar, culture and spirituality, the standard is every young person should be connected to their culture and spiritualities in ways that are meaningful to them, safe, and at their own pace. So that's really important because not every young person who comes into care has the privilege of knowing where they come from. And in Canada, we have overrepresentation of Indigenous youth as well as racialized youth. So oftentimes this is due to colonial assimilation practices. And so it's important to provide opportunities to young people to be able to reconnect with their communities in ways that feel safe for them and in ways that feels authentic to them. So that's why we emphasize that at the end of that standard statement. The sixth pillar, which is health and well-being, the standard is every young person should be provided with timely ongoing services and benefits that support their lifelong health and well-being. These supports need to be offered within a trauma-informed, non-judgmental harm reduction approach without significant wait times. So as you can see, that standard, it's asking a lot, but it's because a lot needs to be done here in Canada regarding that. There are significant wait times for a lot of specialized mental health services. And oftentimes young people will lose their health coverage that they had while they were in care at the age of majority. And that can impact so much, especially if they're on medication for their mental health. And for trans youth, that can even impact their transition. That's definitely something that came up in the Photo Voice project that I did, where a young person who was trans, they lost access to their hormone therapy, and that can be super detrimental to their mental health as well as their physical health. For the advocacy and rights pillar, the standard is that every young person should have their rights respected and should experience environments where their voices are heard and their silence is addressed holistically. That last piece, again, refers to trauma-informed approaches, because just because a young person is quiet or isn't highly engaged doesn't mean that they don't want to. They just might not necessarily have the tools to do so or that confidence in themselves to be able to do so. So this is something that young people need to have the opportunities to learn, and also learn from peers. So involving them with youth and care networks and peer groups is something that we advocate for under this pillar. And the last one, emerging adulthood development, the standard is that every young person should experience environments that cultivate personal growth and development as they transition to adulthood. And I know that there's probably some academics in the room and that might be familiar with emerging adulthood. But really, it's about that transition period between 19 and 29 that young people in the general population tend to have access to, while young people in care oftentimes don't because of those age cutoffs in the legislation and in mandates. And it really developmentally deprives them of accessing things that will help them in their identity formation and being able to make decisions for themselves, figuring out what they want to do with their lives, meaning, belonging, all of that. So we want to emphasize that this needs to be incorporated in legislation. Legislation in Canada, anyway, hasn't really been updated since the 80s. So it's not in line with what we currently know about adolescent brain development as well as emerging adulthood theory. So in terms of the report, and I'll put links in the chat after this presentation, because unfortunately I won't have the time to go through every single pillar with you today. But in the report for the Equitable standards, we have key supports that are listed under every single pillar, and it provides basically an actionable checklist of items for key stakeholders who work with youth and from care to fulfill so that they're meeting the outlined standards. And all these key supports have been defined by and for youth and care. So what we did prior to the release of these Equitable standards and the report, we validated everything with young people who are currently in care and who have recently aged out of care across the country via our National Council members to make sure that everything we were publishing was reflecting the current needs and the pulse of the experiences of young people who are currently aging out of care across the country. So I'm going to go over just a few of the pillars today. So maybe I'll focus on the first two for today, given that these webinars often focus on education and post-secondary education. And I also will send the slides afterwards to share, and all the pillars are in the slides. So for the first pillar, we have a checklist of 21 key financial supports, and those range from guaranteed and livable basic income upon leaving the system based on local realities and inflation of where the young person is living. So that might look different in a rural setting versus an urban setting, for example. We also are advocating for bank accounts with savings being set up as soon as a young person enters care, no matter the age. So whether it is as a child, as a baby, or as a teenager, this needs to set up be set up immediately upon entering care, with regular contributions to savings by the ministry or department responsible for their care. We also advocate for financial and investment literacy that's acquired via accessible and youth-friendly workshops, and also via professionals who understand youth and care realities. So either have lived experience themselves, are experienced working with that population, or have received training. So these types of workshops would be, for example, how to do your taxes through tax clinics, for example, how to build your credit score, how to access disability assistance, employment insurance, investments training and mentorship, and having a financial advisor as well, so that you can do some financial planning throughout your preparation for the transition to adulthood, but also during the transition to adulthood, to really encourage the achievement of financial stability. And for the education and professional development, we have a checklist of 19 key supports, ranging from full post-secondary supports at any time, any level, in any program, and regardless of guardianship status, including out-of-province programs. And what we mean by that is oftentimes any post-care programs for post-secondary here in Canada, they often have eligibility criteria that restricts the young person of having to stay in that province to receive that post-secondary education support. And that can often restrict the youth's options in terms of what type of degree they're going to get or what type of training they're going to get, because some provinces are more rural than others and might not have specialized programming. So it really restricts the opportunities and possibilities in terms of career for young people. So we really want that to be offered without any restrictions whatsoever. And it can also be at any age. So if a young person ages out and at 31, they decide they want to go to post-secondary, whether that's college or university, that they're fully supported to do so. Another thing too is free and up-to-date technology for schooling. So computers, any software, whatever it is that's necessary for a young person to successfully do their schooling. And I think that's even more relevant now, as a lot of things are being done virtually on Zoom, or partly on Zoom, partly in person since the pandemic. And what often happens with youth in care here is they're often given old technology, and we say no, they deserve to have the best to be able to successfully participate and complete their post-secondary education. Another thing under this pillar is employment and training support. So for example, resume and cover letter building, tools and techniques for job searching, practicing interview skills, learning how to navigate wage negotiations, knowing your rights in terms of what employers are allowed to ask of you or to ask you during interviews, and things like that. So I'm going to scroll to the end because I know that we're starting to get towards the 35-minute mark. So in terms of how you can take action for youth in care, and this is what we share with the key stakeholders that we meet with in Canada, but I think it's relevant to you folks here in the States as well. So for professionals and caregivers, we encourage them to read the Equitable Standards Report and really start addressing the key supports that are listed under each pillar that apply to their work and to their relation to youth in care. We encourage them to also center youth voice and engagement in their practice, to connect to local youth and care networks and participate in any trainings and programs that they deliver, and to put pressure on superiors to implement the equitable standards at the organizational level. For politicians and policy decision makers that we meet with, we encourage them to keep their governments accountable to improving the transition to adulthood for youth in care. So making it a political priority when there's elections, making it a priority in terms of when there's a new minister that comes in terms of child protection, committing to implementing the equitable standards, participating in the piloting of the equitable standards evaluation model, which I'll talk a little bit about in a few slides as I wrap up. and to sustainably support local youth and care networks or support the creation of one if there's none that exists. And in terms of researchers and academics, we encourage them to center youth voice and expertise in the research that they do, to invite lived experience expertise in classrooms, to include the equitable standards in their course curriculum, and to create courses and programs that are focused on working with adolescents and emerging adulthoods in care. Especially in Canada anyway, that's severely lacking in social work programs. It's often just maybe a week in a class, in a course. There's certainly no courses that are targeted to that. And also offering it through a trauma-informed and harm reduction lens. So just to quickly wrap up, we are currently piloting an evaluation model. So the evaluation model was released in October of 2022, so just this past October. And it is for the equitable standards, and it's basically a fidelity assessment tool for key stakeholders to assess where they're currently at in meeting the equitable standards and where exactly it is that they need to go to be able to meet these standards over time. So that is a kind of a separate document, as well as a separate presentation that unfortunately I don't have the time to talk about today, but feel free to reach out to me if this is something that you're interested in learning more about. I'll also put links in the chat to the evaluation model and the report that came out in October. But right now, what we're going through in this year of 2023 is that we're getting key stakeholders who work with young people in and from care, whether it's government, the community sector, the private sector, academia, and so on and so forth, to pilot the evaluation model over the course of the year. And what that entails is an assessment at baseline of existing resources, programs, supports, policies, in terms of how they meet the equitable standards or don't, and then releasing a concrete action plan at the end of the year that's public in terms of how you're going to go about meeting these standards over time based on the outcome of the evaluation. Currently, we have a few government stakeholders that are involved. We have the government of New Brunswick who has jumped on board to do a provincial assessment, which is great. We also have a pilot program that's housed under the government in PEI, Prince Edward Island. They're currently doing a pilot program for youth transitioning out of care, and they're going to be doing the evaluation model to assess how their pilot program is currently meeting the standards. We also have quite a few community-based organizations from across the country participating in this. We have about 10 key stakeholders so far, and we're still building on that as we move forward in the year. So that really summarizes very quickly what we're doing. I just want to quickly acknowledge our funders who are making this project a possibility. The Max Bell Foundation, North Pine Foundation, the Children's Aid Foundation of Canada, and the Sandbox Project. So I will leave it at that. My email is on the slide, and you can also follow the League's Twitter as well as my personal Twitter. I post constantly about this project, about the equitable standards and where we're moving. And again, I'll put things in the chat for you to go take a look at after this presentation. So I'll stop it here and I'll leave it up for questions. I think I'll leave it open if you want to ask your questions orally. Feel free to unmute yourself. If not, you can just put it in the chat. Okay.
Thank you. It looks like there is a question in the chat asking, how are you able to provide free technology to all youth?
Well, that's not something that we're looking to do. We're asking the ministries who are responsible for the care of young people as they come into care to do that. And that's not something that is currently being done across the board. And some things that we recommend is, partner up with technology companies, like do a partnership with Mac or Dell, or figure that out. That's for them to figure that out, but we think that it's a standard that should be in place, that every young person who transitions to adulthood from care has free technology and has the most up-to-date technology as well.
there's an additional question here. Could you talk about some of the processes that were used in advocating for the initial policy change regarding the moratorium? What worked well, what didn't work well?
Yeah, so we did a lot of media engagement to get national attention, but also putting pressure on the government. We also wrote letters to the various ministers. We did opinion pieces in the media as well. And so we were able to, I think because we joined forces on a national level, it just put way more pressure on the governments to step up. And we were able to be successful in that. So I think, you know, the advocacy movement here in Canada for youth in care, it's been going on for decades and decades, but oftentimes it's been happening kind of siloed in the provinces and territories. And I think really pooling our advocacy efforts together on a national level has increased the visibility of the issues surrounding aging out of care. And I think also the fact that a lot of us, I would say the majority of the National Council, all have lived experience also really helps to push that message forward. And the fact that we're also connected to young people who are currently in care or have recently aged out of care, it just provides a bigger platform to be able to elevate the voices of young people with lived experience in a way that hadn't really been done before. And I think the pandemic also provided a window of opportunity that wasn't necessarily there before, where governments were starting to realize all the gaps and the cracks in the social service systems, and that there was a willingness to do things differently and to do things more efficiently. So we tried to seize that opportunity to not just advocate for these moratoriums, but also advocate for longer term solutions, because really it's not just an investment in young people, but it's also an investment in just doing things more efficiently. And in the end, there's cost savings in that. And there's been tons of cost benefit analysis that have been done here in Canada as well as in the States, showcasing the benefits of increasing the transition period and increasing different types of supports. So I think it's not necessarily that the governments aren't aware that what we're doing isn't working. It's just a matter of consolidating our advocacy together and offering solutions. So that was also another thing where we were like, here is the roadmap. Here is what you need to do step by step to be able to meet the needs of young people in a more equitable way and in a way that meets them where they're at, instead of forcing them to meet the systems where they're at, because that's been the traditional way of doing things and it's not working. So we're literally presenting the solutions. It's not just recommendations or a report with outcomes and showcasing the issues. We are presenting the solutions. And I think that's what's different about the work that we're currently doing.
So there have been several thank yous for your presentation and how helpful it is for research. An additional question, can you talk more about how we can integrate the equitable standards into our teaching and curriculum?
Yeah, I think, again, I'm trying to figure out how to exit my slideshow. Hold on, there we go. So I'm gonna put all of that into the chat right now. So I would recommend to go and read the report of the equitable standards. There's also on the National Council of Youth and Care Advocates webpage, there's a full 1-hour webinar that explains in depth the equitable standards. You can show that in your classrooms if you want. It's free and accessible for you to do so. Yes, this was developed in a Canadian context, but I think there's a lot of connections to the experiences of youth in the US as well. So I think it's still very relevant to the American experience. So I'm putting the documents here in the chat, as well as the link to the National Council webpage, where you can find everything from the moratorium map that I showed you, who's a member of the council, the successes we've had to date, as well as the publications and the webinars that we've done to date. And I'll put my contact information there again as well.
Thank you so much. Are there any further questions for Dr. Doucet? I see here. What can the US learn from the Equitable Standards Initiative in Canada?
Okay. Well, again, like I said, I think the experiences are similar, even though maybe the legislative context is a bit different. Because I know in the US, you have kind of US like country level legislation that encourages the states to provide post-care supports to young people, and we don't have that in Canada. We actually use the US as an example in terms of legislative framework, in terms of what we should be doing here in Canada. But because this is the very first, standards of its kind developed by and for young people with lived experience in care, I think it could definitely be used as an example of things to do in other countries as well. So in terms of like the 8 pillars, I think that's relevant, to all young people transitioning from care, because it's really looking at their need areas holistically. In terms of the key supports as well, there might be some variances in terms of what's currently available from state to state, for example, but it's still something I think that is very much so applicable in the US. And I'd be more than happy to discuss this further if there's interest in diving deeper into the equitable standards and how it could be used in the US context.
Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Doucet. This was very helpful and informative. It's amazing to hear about the work that you were doing, and just appreciate your time today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you all for being here. The presentation, both the recording and the PowerPoint presentation, will be available via the website as well here shortly. So you can look for that as well. And with that, thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.